September 2, 1945. A small flat in London. Temperature, mild autumn evening. 24-year-old Margaret Clark sits at her kitchen table, pen hovering over blank paper. She wants to write to her mother about what she's done for the past 4 years, about the work that ended the war, the machines that broke impossible codes, the secret that saved millions of lives. But she can't. The Official Secrets Act she signed in 1941 forbids it. Not just during wartime, forever. Her mother believes Margaret spent the war filing papers at some government office. Her fiancé thinks she was a clerk. Her friends assume she did nothing important. And Margaret can never tell them otherwise. She signs the letter with love, mentions the weather, asks about rationing, the same bland correspondence she's written throughout the war. What she cannot write: I was a codebreaker at Bletchley Park. I helped decrypt German Enigma messages. I contributed to victories at sea, in Africa, in Europe. I mattered. Instead, she seals the envelope and begins a silence that will last 50 years. This is Margaret Clark's story, the codebreaker who never told, and the thousands like her who carried Britain's greatest secret to their graves. Margaret Clark grew up in Birmingham, daughter of a schoolteacher and a factory foreman. She excelled in mathematics and languages at grammar school, unusual subjects for girls in the 1930s, but her teachers encouraged her aptitude. In 1938, she won a place at Cambridge University to read mathematics. War interrupted her studies after only 2 years. In early 1941, Cambridge received a discreet inquiry from the Foreign Office. Could they recommend female students with mathematical or linguistic abilities for unspecified government work? Margaret's tutor suggested her. The recruitment process was deliberately vague. An interview in London. Questions about discretion, about whether she could keep secrets from family and friends. No explanation of what the work would involve. She was told only that it was important war work, that she would sign the Official Secrets Act, and that she must never discuss her employment with anyone, not during the war, not after, not ever. On a cold March morning in 1941, Margaret arrived by train at Bletchley, a small market town 50 miles north of London. A car collected her from the station. Through the gates of a Victorian mansion surrounded by temporary wooden huts, she entered Britain's best-kept secret, the Government Code and Cipher School, where mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions worked to break German military codes. Bletchley Park operated on 3 8-hour shifts around the clock. Margaret was assigned to Hut 6, the section responsible for breaking German Army and Air Force Enigma codes. The work was mentally exhausting. German operators changed Enigma settings daily at midnight. Each day began a race: intercept messages, identify patterns, test possible settings, break the day's code before it changed again. Margaret worked with sheets of intercepted messages, seemingly random 5-letter groups transmitted by German military radio stations across Europe and North Africa. Her task: identify patterns, recognize repeated phrases, spot operator errors that might provide entry points for breaking the code. The Enigma machine was theoretically unbreakable, billions of possible settings, changed daily. But humans made mistakes. German operators sometimes used predictable message openings, weather reports beginning with Wettervorhersage, weather forecast, messages ending with Heil Hitler. These cribs, predicted plaintext, allowed Bletchley's bombs, electromechanical machines designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, to test thousands of settings rapidly. When a bomb found a match, WWII could decrypt that day's messages. Margaret spent 8-hour shifts studying columns of letters, marking possible cribs, calculating probabilities. The work required absolute concentration. One missed pattern could mean a day's intelligence lost. One successful crib could reveal German battle plans, ship positions, supply routes, intelligence that saved thousands of Allied lives. The psychological burden of secrecy was immense. Margaret lived in billets in Bletchley Town with other young women who worked at the park. They couldn't discuss their work even with each other. Different sections of Bletchley operated on strict need-to-know principles. At the dinner table, they made small talk about weather, rationing, BBC radio programs. Never about work. When home on leave visiting Birmingham, Margaret's mother would ask, "What exactly do you do at that government office?" Margaret would answer vaguely, "Clerical work, nothing important really." Very boring actually. Her mother sometimes pressed, "But surely you're contributing something to the war effort?" Margaret longed to reply, "Mother, I'm helping break codes that locate U-boats threatening our Atlantic convoys. I'm reading German battle plans before their own commanders receive them. I'm part of the most successful intelligence operation in history." Instead, just paperwork, really. Nothing exciting. The lies compounded. A childhood friend serving with the Women's Auxiliary Air Force wrote asking about Margaret's war work. Margaret, who couldn't reveal she was reading Luftwaffe communications before they were decoded, wrote back, "I'm afraid my war is rather dull compared to yours." Government filing, mostly. She watched newsreels showing D-Day landings whose timing was informed by Enigma intelligence from Bletchley, and couldn't tell anyone she'd contributed. She read newspaper accounts of submarine battles won through convoy rerouting based on decoded U-boat positions, and remained silent. The work had tangible impacts Margaret could never acknowledge. In May 1943, WWII broke Enigma messages revealing U-boat positions in the Atlantic. Convoys were rerouted. Hundreds of merchant seamen survived who would otherwise have perished. Margaret had worked on the cribs that helped break those messages. She would never receive recognition. In June 1943, decoded messages revealed German reinforcement plans in North Africa. Allied commanders used the intelligence to position forces advantageously. Battles were won with fewer casualties because of information Margaret and her colleagues provided. She read about Montgomery's victories in newspapers, knowing she'd contributed but unable to tell anyone. D-Day, June 6, 1944. The invasion succeeded partly because Bletchley had convinced German intelligence through careful manipulation of decoded messages that the landing would occur elsewhere. Margaret watched newsreels of soldiers waiting ashore, knowing that Codebreaker's work had helped protect them. Silence. By 1944, Bletchley was breaking thousands of German messages daily. The intelligence flow, codenamed Ultra, gave Allied commanders unprecedented insight into enemy plans. Historians later estimated Ultra shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years, saving millions of lives. Margaret was one of thousands who made Ultra possible. And for 50 years, she couldn't tell anyone. The psychological cost accumulated. Living with fundamental dishonesty, telling family and friends that her war work was insignificant when it was crucial. Watching others receive recognition for contributions less vital than hers. Carrying knowledge that could never be shared. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Margaret stood with colleagues outside the huts at Bletchley, listening to Churchill's broadcast announcing Germany's surrender. Around her, young women who'd spent years breaking unbreakable codes, who'd shortened the war and saved countless lives, celebrated quietly. No public recognition. No medals. No acknowledgement. Within days, the dismantling began. The bombs were destroyed or removed. Papers were burned. Huts were cleared. Workers received stern reminders. The official Secrets Act remained in force. What they'd done must never be revealed. Margaret returned to civilian life in London. She finished her mathematics degree, became a teacher. When asked about her war service, she maintained the fiction, clerical work for the Foreign Office. Rather boring, really. She married in 1946. Her husband knew only the cover story. She wanted to tell him, this man she loved and trusted, about the most significant work of her life. But the act forbade it. She had signed, and her signature bound her to silence. Children came. They grew up never knowing their mother had been a codebreaker. When they studied World War II in school, Margaret helped with homework, carefully concealing that she'd been inside one of the war's most important operations. Her son asked once, "Mom, what did you do in the war?" Same answer, "Just paperwork, darling. Nothing interesting." The weight of living a lie pressed constantly. At reunions with university friends, conversations turned to careers and accomplishments. Margaret taught mathematics at a girls' school, good work, but it couldn't be compared to breaking Enigma. Yet she couldn't mention Enigma. Watching films about the war, seeing books published about battles and campaigns, she knew the hidden story, the intelligence that had shaped those outcomes. And she couldn't tell. Decades passed. The 1950s, 60s, 70s. Margaret taught mathematics, raised her family, lived an ordinary life. But she carried extraordinary secrets. In 1974, a book appeared, The Ultra Secret by F.W. Winterbotham. For the first time, Bletchley Park's work was publicly revealed. The British government, 30 years after war's end, partially lifted the curtain. Margaret read the book with tears running down her face. Finally, someone was telling the story. But the official Secrets Act still applied to those who'd actually done the work. She still couldn't discuss her own role. Her family read about Bletchley Park. Her grown children asked, "Did you know about this? Weren't you in some government office near there during the war?" So close. She remained vague. "I knew there was something happening, but we weren't told details." Still lying, even after partial declassification. Through the 1980s, more information emerged. Books, documentaries, academic studies. The importance of Bletchley's work became clear. Ultra-intelligence had shortened the war by years, saved millions of lives, represented one of history's greatest intelligence achievements. And Margaret still couldn't say, "I was there. I did this work." In 1991, the government finally released Bletchley Park workers from their obligation of secrecy. 50 years after Margaret had first signed the official Secrets Act, she could finally speak. She was 70 years old. She contacted old colleagues. They organized reunions. For the first time, they could share memories of the work, compare experiences, acknowledge what they'd accomplished. Margaret finally told her family. Her children were stunned. "Mom, you were a codebreaker? Why didn't you ever tell us?" How could she explain 50 years of enforced silence? Margaret Clark spent her final years giving interviews, speaking to schools and historical societies. She wanted young people to understand what Bletchley Park had accomplished and what the silence had cost. "We saved lives," she would say. "We shortened the war. But we couldn't tell anyone. For 50 years, my family thought I'd spent the war filing papers. I couldn't share the most important thing I'd ever done." The psychological impact of that enforced silence was profound. Living with daily dishonesty, even with loved ones. Watching others receive recognition while her own crucial contributions remained classified. Feeling that the most significant period of her life had been erased from history. Many Bletchley veterans struggled with this. Some never adjusted to post-war life, unable to find work as intellectually challenging as codebreaking, unable to explain why they were qualified for positions requiring mathematical or analytical skills. Others carried guilt at surviving the war without physical danger, not recognizing that their mental contributions were as vital as combat service. The enforced silence also meant trauma went untreated. Working under constant pressure, knowing that errors could cost lives, never being able to discuss that stress, many Bletchley workers suffered what would now be recognized as anxiety or depression, but couldn't seek help because they couldn't explain what caused their distress. Margaret Clark passed away in 2004, age 83. Her obituary finally acknowledged her wartime service, codebreaker at Bletchley Park who helped shorten World War II. Recognition came at last, too late for much of her life, but not too late for history to record her contribution. Today, Bletchley Park is a museum. Hut 6, where Margaret worked, has been preserved. Visitors can see where codebreakers sat, where they studied intercepted messages, where they identified the patterns that broke Enigma. The museum honors the thousands who worked there, the mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and clerical staff who together created the most successful intelligence operation in history. But the museum can't fully convey the human cost of secrecy. The burden of living for 50 years unable to share your most important accomplishment. The isolation of knowing you'd contributed significantly to victory but receiving no recognition. The daily dishonesty of lying to family and friends about what you'd done. Margaret Clark represents thousands of Bletchley Park workers who kept Britain's greatest secret for half a century. Their silence protected post-war intelligence capabilities. The techniques developed at Bletchley remained classified because they formed the foundation of Cold War codebreaking. Their sacrifice was necessary and voluntary. But it was still a sacrifice. These codebreakers won the war without firing a shot, shortened the conflict by years, saved millions of lives, and then disappeared back into ordinary life, carrying secrets they could never share. We owe them recognition not just for their wartime work, but for the 50 years of silence that followed. Stories like Margaret Clark's deserve to be remembered, not as triumphant tales of victory, but as honest accounts of the human cost of secrecy, and the courage it took to carry that burden for a lifetime.